Hello, and welcome to another segment of the Coatesville Area Public Library's Oral History Project. I'm your host, Kirk Witmer, and with me today is someone who has spent all of her life right here in the Coatesville area. Please welcome Marion Stoner. Marion, it's nice to have you with us today.
Nice to be here.
Marion, you have been studying the history of the Coatesville area for quite a number of years, and rightly so, because you are a direct descendant, I understand, of one of the earliest settlers here, William Fleming. Tell us, if you would, a little of William Fleming's history and how he came to be in our area.
Well, William Fleming came over to this country on a ship with his uncle and landed on the eastern shore, and his uncle got the things that he needed for the ship and was going back to the old country, but he didn't tell his nephew he had indentured him as a servant. And so when William Fleming went down to get on his uncle's ship, it was gone. And he had to work off his indenture before he could go up the eastern shore to a home of the Moore family. And he stayed there for a while and married their daughter Mary, and then came up to the Coatesville area. He was the first white man here. Peter Bazillon had been here before him. And he built a log house in Coatesville, which they tore down about 1935, I think.
Do we know where this house was located?
I do, where Gordon School was built. And then he also built the house behind, well, it's no longer the Baptist Church. It's been sold recently.
At 5th and Main.
Fifth and Main. It's on Kersey Street. Is that behind the alley behind the Baptist Church? He built that house there, and it's on a little angle. It's a farmhouse, and there used to be a barn behind it, but I think it was torn down a few years ago. And the house was built to face the stream that came from the spring where the library is built. And when they built the library, they have to pump water out of the basement.
Yes, they do.
Because they don't realize. And I talked to one of the people that was on that committee and said, why in the world did you build a library on a spring? Well, nobody told us there was a spring there. Well, if you check the old maps, you can see where the spring was. And there is also a spring in the basement of that house. And when I went there to take pictures, I asked about the spring, and the lady that owned the house didn't know there was a spring down there. And she was hanging up clothes in the backyard, and I said, well, see where that padlock is on the back door in the basement? Perhaps we can look in there. And she said, well, I think I have the key. So she went up and she got the key, and we walked in, and the spring was still there, and the water was flowing, and I took a picture of it.
I understand they built that house on the spring in the event of Indian attacks, so that they would still have a fresh supply of water.
That's right. A lot of them did that. Yes. And William Fleming's grandson, and I have some William Fleming deeds. The oldest deed I have is 1703 in the reign of Queen Anne. And when I was in Westminster Abbey in England, I asked them where Queen Anne was buried. And they said, here in Westminster Abbey with her 17 children. So that particular deed I have framed now, and would like to share it with you sometime.
There were some other prominent names in and around the Coatesville area after William Fleming. Moses Coates comes to mind, and I'm sure you can tell us of others.
Well, Moses Coates, Coatesville was first known as Bridgetown because of the bridge that went across the Brandywine.
And this would have been in what years?
Well, it was before 1812, because in 1812 Moses Coates became the postmaster, and that's why a lot of towns named their villages or towns or whatever after the postmaster. But I always thought it should have been Flemington, because it was the Flemings that came here and owned all this land. And there was George Fleming and Peter Fleming, who married a Hope, and Peter Fleming's house is the one that Rebecca Lukens bought and lived in. and it's marked for Rebecca Lukens, but it's not marked for Peter Fleming. And then in West Coatesville, at the corner of Strode Avenue and Valley, is John Fleming's house, and he was William's grandson, and he served on the committee with Benjamin Franklin to frame the first Constitution of Pennsylvania.
Marion, here we are in 1999, and the Coatesville Area School District has just purchased a piece of property out in Valley Township. But I understand there is a certain history connected with that property as well. Please share it with us.
Yes, the property next to Rainbow School was where my Revolutionary ancestor lived, and that was Joseph Cowan. And he was the son of Hugh Cowan, who built the next home to the west that had been restored some time ago by Chris and Irma Stolzfus. And Hugh Cowan and his son Joseph planted their trees, the big sycamore trees, were little ones then, the same day. And the reason that the one on the Turney place, which is the name that you would recognize, grew so big was because Joseph Cowan was a blacksmith, and he had his shop under that tree, and he threw his old horseshoes and nails out under that tree, and it fertilized the tree. Now, when he first was given that land by his father, well, he really bought it from him, it didn't cost very much. He built a log house, as his father Hugh Cowan had done, behind the house to the west. And it was to kind of the northeast of the present building that's standing there, which I understand will be bulldozed down when they build the mega school.
Marion, there's also a school property out in Hayti that you can give us some information about, is there not?
There is. It was across from what is now Orth Brothers cleaning place. And it was on the hill there under an oak tree. And the Withrows, the Cowans, and the Flemings, and the Scotts bought that property from John and Abigail Cowan Fleming. And this one-room school was built there. My great-grandmother went there. And she recalled one day they were out playing at recess time, and they egged one of the boys to climb this high oak tree. And he kept going up, and they kept saying, "Go higher, go higher." And he fell out of that oak tree and killed himself. And she never got over that. But that was before public schools, and it was dated 1800, the deed. So that's the story of that particular school.
Marion, I understand that you have ancestors of various lineages scattered all around the area, and they were each landowners in their own right. Share some of that background with us, please.
Well, my Cowan ancestors I've just referred to.
Yes.
And then I have Park ancestors that Parksburg was built on, and Withrow ancestors that Wagontown was built on. But I also have Skiles ancestors who were French Huguenot that live out near Compass. I have ancestors in that area. And then Westwood is built on my Scott, Martin, and Hope ancestors' land. Gumtree is my Thorn Muse ancestors in that area. So I go back to the original Pengrants.
Well, you'd be a very wealthy woman if all that were passed down to you, wouldn't you?
Oh, wouldn't I? Oh, today, yes. But we lived for 10 years on Samuel Withrow's farm, which is where Kings Highway land was taken from that farm.
For the Kings Highway Elementary School.
Kings Highway Elementary School. Yes.
Marion, born in 1919.
Right.
If you would, share some of your early childhood memories with us in and around the Coatesville area.
Well, my father lived on the farm that the Coatesville Airport is built on now. And he was one of 13 children, and he married my mother, who was Edith Cowan, and they bought land in Sadsburyville. And in order to buy the land, the property that he wanted to build on, which was the town dump, he had to buy 3 log houses in Sadsburyville next door. So he built a brick house there, and it was written up by Wayne Morris in the Coatesville Record as palatial, but it's not very palatial.
How palatial isn't it?
It's just a brick house, and that's where I grew up. And my brother, Jack Martin, who was in the Air Force, the 2 of us were raised there. And I can remember my father taking me the first day of school down to the telephone pole in the middle of Sadsburyville and saying, "You come here because you can look east and west and see whether there are cars coming on the Lincoln Highway." And of course that was before it was really paved the way it is now. It was just a 2-lane highway then. And I would walk down, and he took me the first day to meet the teacher, and we went to school there for 8 years. And when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I helped the teacher teach 1st and 2nd grade. And in 1935, I think it was, they paved the Lincoln Highway and rerouted all the traffic on Valley Road, and we learned to roller skate on
the new paving.
Which was cement.
Marion, if you would think back to the 1930s, you would have been a teenager. Share with us how the Depression years impacted your family life.
Well, the first thing I think of is cutting soles for my shoes that were worn out of shredded wheat boxes and putting in the bottom of my shoes so I wouldn't have to walk on the ground.
Yes.
But we didn't have school buses. We had to get to school the best way we could, and my father drove into the bank every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, and I had to be ready to come in with him, and I would sit in Young's drugstore or Thompson's drugstore. And
where was that located?
Thompson's drugstore was on about 2nd Avenue in Coatesville, and Frank Johnson worked there, and he gave me my first camera when it was a little box camera. But I spent more time with Frank Johnson, I think, and he was the nicest black man you'd ever want to meet. He was like my second father in Coatesville because he got all my woes told to him and all my aches and pains, and then I would come there after school and wait until my father was ready to go home in order to go home. Now, a couple of times we tried to hitchhike, but that didn't work out so well because in those days there were mostly salesmen that could afford cars to drive. In fact, the day I was born in 1919, my mother's brother came in and said, "Edith, I just bought a new car." And there weren't many people that had cars in those days. And could I take your daughter for a ride in my new car? And then when my mother learned to drive her car, Harry Chalfin, who had the Chalfin car place in Lenover, was the one that taught her to drive a car. And they made cars out there in Lenover in those days.
Are there any other Depression year memories you'd like to share with us?
Well, let's see. Bread was 3 cents
A loaf.
a loaf. I could get a whole pail of milk from the local dairy for 10 cents. We had a change of clothes for school, and we had a dress for Sunday to go to church and Sunday school. And so we didn't need big closets in those days like they need today because we didn't have much to put in them.
Yes. What did you do for entertainment as a teenager?
Well, we had a lot of fun, but in different ways. We had square dances, and we had socials where we packed boxes and baskets of food, and then the fellas would buy them. And we always had kids at our house to play hide and seek, and we would have popcorn and something to drink. We didn't have sodas in those days, so it was fruit juice or something like that. Even milk and crackers before we went to bed. So we made our own amusement, and I was taught how to play different games like checkers and old card games. And my father loved to play checkers, and he taught me to play checkers, and I would beat him until I learned how to play the game, and then I never beat him. So we did, and we learned to sew, we learned to cook, and we did a lot of things that people try to find someone else to do today.
Tell me more about the schools that you attended. I know you said you started out in a one-room schoolhouse. Where did you end your high school years?
In Coatesville High School.
Which was where?
Now, do you know where Coatesville High School
I
was?
do, but I want to hear you tell me.
Well, it was right on Main Street, where Benner School is.
Yes.
And a few years ago, we were written up in the Coatesville Record as having our reunion from Cash. Well, we never went to Cash. Cash wasn't even built, because in those days, where the intermediate school now was Harry Martin's wildflower garden, and it was in a swamp. And I could never understand why they built that school in a swamp, because I was sure that it would sink one of these days, and I guess it's what's happening to it right now. But anyway, no, we graduated and were the largest graduating class, and I can't remember exactly how many.
Well, Marion, the late years of the Depression, and you're now coming out of high school, what prospects were awaiting you?
Well, my father didn't believe in girls going to college, but my mother had gone to Westchester Normal School, and she thought girls should be educated too. So we looked at different colleges. Wilson College was one. We went to Beaver College, and she decided, and my father also said I could go to Beaver College.
But given your father's attitude toward girls and education, I'm sure there were some very hot discussions in the living room.
Well, no, my
No?
father was a man of few words, and he thought perhaps my mother was right. But anyway, when I graduated from Beaver College, I was in I think there were about 10 or 15, no, 10, 12 of us on a special honors list, and I didn't tell him I was there. And when he came to graduation, he opened the program and looked and saw that I was there, and then he had to turn away and blow his nose and wipe his eyes. So I knew then that he was satisfied that he had spent his money wisely.
Yes. So what were your prospects then after coming out of school?
Well, that was when Pearl Harbor happened. And in my living room, I was standing with my future husband, and he was in a Navy uniform the day Pearl Harbor was announced. So I had graduated as an art student, and I was taking freelance art into Philadelphia. I had worked at Bendix then after he went overseas.
Now tell us about Bendix.
Bendix, we made gyroscopic compasses for submarines. And I was taking my freelance artwork into Philadelphia to the different places that I always went to. And I thought, this is silly. I want to be doing something to help the fellows overseas. And so I heard somebody say they're hiring out at Bendix. So I got on a bus and I went out to Bendix on North Broad Street. And I went into the office, and it was lined with people, crowded with people. And about 2 o'clock, this was about 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they came out and said, we've hired everybody that we need but a draftsman. If you have your drawings, please step forward. So I stepped forward with my drawings, which were not
Drafting at all.
Not drafting at all. And he said, please come in here to this office. So I walked in, And the gentleman behind the desk looked at me and he said, are those your drawings? And I said, yes, they are. And he said, did you graduate from college? And I said, yes, I did. And he said, you're hired. And he never looked at my drawings. So another girl and I worked with the engineers to set up this program to make these stators.
Mhm.
And they had a steel, I don't know what you would call it, but it was a piece of steel that they would fit these stators on to build them.
Now, what's a stator?
A stator is two Bakelite rings with little knobs around the top, and you wind different color threads around, and they have to be tied a certain way on top to be put into this submarine compass
Mhm.
before it would work. So that's what we did. And then after they perfected everything, we taught the other girls as they came in how to do this. So that's what we did at Bendix.
Mhm.
I also worked at 19th and Chestnut in Philadelphia and taught ceramics at the Jane Sneed studio down there. And then Jane Sneed sent me out to Jenkintown, and I worked in the studio there. I also worked with a friend of mine whose brother was in the service until he came home part-time in the Sharpless stationery store in Jenkintown. And I worked out at Beth Ayres in a glass factory and blew glass bulbs for submarines also.
Mhm. So you were a glass blower too?
I was a glass blower, not very long, but I did it.
What did glass blowers make back then? Can you recall?
Oh, I don't even remember, but I remember at Bendix, my rent for the month was $15, and I roomed at a room in Jenkintown.
Mhm.
They put us on group bonus first, or was it individual? Well, anyway, I made about $30 a month, and then they changed, they came around with time clocks and timed everybody, and then they changed us, I think, to group. It was either from group to individual or from individual to group. But for about 2 months, we made $90 a month. And then they finally realized they'd done something wrong because there was too much money coming.
I was going to say, $90 a month was
From
pretty
50
good money back then.
Back then, it was
Yeah.
unusual.
Mhm. So you spent the war years helping the war effort, essentially.
Right.
And then came back to Coatesville?
We were married and lived in Jenkintown, where I had been rooming with a former college professor. Oh, and I forgot to tell you that let's see, this was the day that my husband went overseas after we were married. My rifle coach at Beaver had to go into, he did very precision-oriented work for a gun maker there in Jenkintown.
Mhm.
And that was his strong point. He made his own guns. So when I went to Beaver, they said to me, you have to take 2 semesters of riflery, or not riflery, of gym. And I said, well, what do you have that I haven't done? Because I've done hockey and basketball. Well, they had fencing and riflery. So I said, well, I'll take a semester of each one of those. So I started riflery first, and I went down to the rifle range, and I was shown how to put the gun on and get down on the mat and aim toward the target.
Mhm.
And he said, would you like to shoot? And I said, yes, I'd like to try it. So the first target that I finished was a 98 out of 100. And he said, what team were you on before? And I said, I've never been on a team before. And he said, would you like to join our rifle team? And I said, sure. So then when we graduated, I was co-captain of the rifle team.
Mhm.
We were second in the United States in intercollegiate competition, and I was 10th in the nation that year.
Mhm.
So,
Now, I have to ask you, Marion, as a former fencer myself, tell me about the exploits of your fencing career during the other semester.
well, fencing didn't go as well. I wasn't as nimble on my feet. I was not a fencer. but I finished my semester. But because I could teach riflery, I went to a camp in New Hampshire and taught riflery up there.
Mm-hmm.
And then when my coach went into the war work, I taught at Beaver College while he was doing the war work. And the day that he finished that was the day that my husband came home from the South Pacific. So it worked out very well because he could go back to teaching and I could go home with my husband. And we went to a house in Sadsburyville and bought that and had 6 apartments there.
Mm-hmm.
So I managed apartments and had babies after that.
Now, I'm thinking that back in the early 40s, it was probably very unusual to have a woman involved in riflery and fencing.
Well, it was, and I was going to go to the Baldwin School. I went there and was interviewed, and they were going to put a rifle range in, and I was going to teach there. But because of the shortage of ammunition, and it just didn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was up at the camp in New Hampshire, we had different relays that would shoot these targets. And before I go into that, I should tell you about Penguin out here. You know where Penguin is?
Penguin Industries.
Yes.
Out near the Coatesville
They
Airport.
bought Hoppy out. Do you know about Hoppy?
Tell us.
Well, he's the one that perfected the cleaning fluid and oil that people use on their guns, and they're still used today. Well, when I was at Beaver, we shot against, what was the team in South Philadelphia? Oh, senior moment. Anyway, Mr. Hoppy was a member of that team, and I shot against him, and we won.
Good for you.
Our team won. And then we would go up to Schober's cabin in Buckingham Mountains, and we would shoot against them up there too.
Mm-hmm.
So those men never got over the fact that these girls could beat them because they were really one of the best teams in the whole United States.
But at any rate, as you started to say earlier, you returned to Coatesville and took on some rental properties.
Yes.
What were rents going for after the war years?
During the time that we owned, when we first owned the apartment houses, there was a ceiling on apartments, and you could not charge anything more than what they had been.
Mm-hmm.
So we got $17 a month rent for the apartments that we had out there. And we couldn't quite meet all our obligations with that. But the first year that we did, we made $5. And so we went out and celebrated. We went out to dinner that night.
I hope you didn't spend it all in one place.
We did. $5 was what we paid for 2 meals.
Marion, I'm interested in the rent ceilings. Was there a reason for that?
The government, in order to keep the rent down, because people were being charged, they had more money than they had ever had in their lives because they were getting higher pays in these factories. At Lucan's, and of course at Bendix, where I had worked. And so people were being charged. Well, it's just like today, if there's a football game someplace and you go to get a hotel room, it doubles.
Mm-hmm.
When we came back from Montana 5 years ago maybe now, we traveled, and the day that school opened and all the children were out and ready to go on trips with their parents, the hotel rooms doubled, and the prices of food doubled. And that's exactly what happened back then.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to protect these people, and now we need something like that, I think, to protect
Put
the
a cap on
retired
it.
people from being charged all the taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Because in Texas, when you are in Texas and reach 65, your school taxes are lowered instead of raised.
Yes. Marion, I've heard it said that nothing will stimulate a slow economy like a war.
You're
And
right.
of course, we had a depression in the 30s.
You're right.
How did the economy improve after the war? I'm sure we had a lot of veterans returning and looking for jobs.
Mm-hmm. We did, and the veterans in those days were respected. And of course, you know, after the Vietnam War, veterans were spit on when they came back. And they weren't given preferential treatment like the veterans that came back after the Second World War. They were heroes, and they were celebrated, and they were given good jobs. And they had been trained in the service. In those days, you got good training when you went into the service, and you were ready for a job when you got out. So I hope it continues that way in the service. But I'm wondering, in the changing of our lifestyle these days, whether our children are being trained or our veterans are trained to do a job when they come back.
Marion, you have lived through what has been referred to as the glory days of Coatesville or the boomtown days
Absolutely.
of Coatesville. Share with us your memories of what downtown Coatesville was like.
Well, my father was president of Chester Valley Bank, and he knew everybody in town, and everybody knew him. Whether they liked him or not was another thing, because if he said no to a loan they wanted, they probably didn't like him, and they'd go to the other bank. But
Which was what bank?
That was the National Bank of Coatesville. And of course, we were good friends with the Ellis Stearns, and he was president of the other bank. So we used to get together and joke about, we were the other bank to them, and they were the other bank to us.
Right. Now, there wasn't any collusion on fixing loan rates or anything, was there?
Absolutely not in those days. Not in those days, no. In fact, my father never discussed banking with us. We never knew anything, and we were glad we didn't, because people would come to us and say, well, I suppose you know, we borrowed money, and we'd say, no, we haven't a clue. Daddy never said a word about anybody's. Anything they did was a private matter, and he kept it private.
I'm sorry I interrupted you. You were
Well-
going to share some of your downtown memories with us.
Well, I was going to tell you a story about my father when there was a veteran. Well, he was a soldier in those days. He went overseas, and Daddy didn't tell me this. One of the people that worked in the bank told me this later. But anyway, this woman came in with her baby, lived here in Coatesville. They had not eaten for a whole week because she had not received anything from her husband after he went overseas, and she was supposed to. She wasn't able to pay the rent. They were going to kick her out. She wasn't able, they took out the telephone, the electric was cut off, and Daddy said, and she wanted to borrow money. So Daddy said, do you have a car? And she said, no. And he said, well, what about your husband's family? Well, he didn't have a family, and she didn't have a family. And Daddy said, well, I can't lend you any money because you have no collateral. But he said, I'll give you whatever you need to pay the rent and to buy what you need. And so he took it out of his pocket and gave it to her and said, when you need some more, come back and see me. And so the next time she came back, she had heard from her husband, and she got the money that was due them from the service. And so she was able to live after that.
So her husband being a serviceman, were times tough for the families
Well,
of servicemen?
the service people got some compensation from the government when they were like that, but he had not been able to send any of his pay money home. Something had happened to it.
Huh.
So that was the story. But usually the fellows sent money back home when they got it, because they didn't have any place to spend it unless they were stationed in another country.
Marion, you were spending some time in Jenkintown during the war. When you returned to the area, did you notice any significant changes? Was anything missing?
Well, no, there was a lot more added to the area, I think, when I came home. And besides, when you become more mature, I guess you'd call it, things that looked big to me looked smaller. Schools looked smaller. Businesses looked smaller, because I've been in Philadelphia and seen things that were bigger, I guess.
Here we are in 1999. When you think back over all the changes that you've seen in and around Coatesville, what sticks out in your mind?
Well, when I was growing up, Coatesville was the center of the county. It was a city. And we had people like J.I. Hoffman, and we had the Sunday afternoon meetings, and everybody came from all sections of the county to come to that.
Mhm.
The banks were booming here, the stores were booming here.
Where were the meetings that you mentioned?
In the auditorium
Mhm.
that's now
The Coatesville Towers.
Coatesville Towers,
Mhm.
right. And
Tell
it's-
me about some of those meetings. They've been a point of interest for a number of people, but I'd like to get your take. You obviously attended some of them, I would hope.
Oh, we didn't miss any of them.
Yeah.
But
What were they like?
well, we had all the important people of the day would be engaged to come and talk. And then we had a Coatesville orchestra, and Mr. Stiles played the organ. And where did that organ go? I know they sent it someplace, and I know where it went, having another senior moment. But that was, people came just to hear that organ and to hear the orchestra. So, and the
How large of an orchestra was it, do you recall?
filled the front, and Harry Webster played the trumpet, and he taught a lot of kids how to play that instrument. But no, there were crowds of people that came to hear that from everywhere. J. Smedley Butler was one of them. Admiral Byrd, and Admiral Byrd was a trustee of Beaver College when I was there,
Mhm.
and they entertained all the trustees. Mr. Hines from Pittsburgh was another one. And they had the trustees all come for a dinner each year.
Mhm.
And Admiral Byrd found the cook's door key in his mashed potatoes. So you know girls never forget things like that.
Oh, my goodness. Marion, what about utilities in the area?
Well, Mr. James Latta in Parksburg was instrumental in putting the first telephone poles to carry the electric lines in this area. And he wrote a paper that his son Jim Latta had in Westchester.
And what years are we talking about?
Well, in the early 20s,
Mhm.
when the electric came out this way. And I know, I can remember my mother's amazement at having electric in her house. And so since then, a lot of things depend on electric, but back in those days, we had lanterns and candles, and we didn't really expect the electric to work like it did.
Uh-huh. Marion, I'm sure you've probably got some interesting stories to tell us about the changes that you've seen in transportation in our area too, as well, don't you?
Yes, because automobiles were a new thing when I was born. And before that, the Conestoga wagons used to go up Kings Highway. And when they started up the hill, before they crossed the Brandywine,
Mm-hmm.
there would be someone there to signal the inn at at Wagontown, which was called the Sign of the Wagon, I think. How many people would be there for dinner?
Now,
So
how did they
could-
how did they signal the inn ahead?
There was a signal. That's just what I read. I don't
Okay.
know what it was, but they got a signal up there about how many people would be coming. But when they would cross the Brandywine, there was no bridge there then. And in the wintertime, it would freeze, and sometimes the wagons would go through the ice and get stuck, and then they couldn't get them out, and they would freeze. And you think you have a traffic backup now with
Oh, my.
automobiles? Well, you should have heard the men that had the Conestoga wagons that wanted to get through. But they would stay at the Brandywine Inn, and now somebody's bought that, and they're fixing it up. It was falling down, and the porch fell off.
And where is this located?
It's at 82 and 340 going west
Mm-hmm.
on 340, and it's just over the Brandywine to the right. It's on that corner there.
Mhm.
And then as you start up the hill, up the hill is Wagontown.
Right.
And that's where the Sign of the Wagon is. The Gibler brothers have restored that.
Mhm.
And so that was used before the Lincoln Highway. That was the King's Highway.
Okay. Now, the Kings Highway was used before the Lincoln Highway existed?
Mm-hmm. Because I forget the date that the Lincoln Highway was built. But down through Sadsburyville, the old road was the Wilmington Road. And so the little part of Harry's that faces the Wilmington Road in Sadsburyville is the oldest building in Sadsburyville. There are lots of log houses in Sadsburyville. Most of them are covered up, but I can tell you which ones are log.
Well, Marion Stoner, I can't thank you enough for being part of our oral history project. You've given us some very valuable insights into the history of our community, and we really appreciate you being a participant in this project.
Well, I'm glad because I think history needs to be preserved, and this is the only way that it's going to be preserved around here because the landscape is going to change.
I'm sure of that.
Thank you.
Thank you again.